Hey everybody, my son is an avid cross-country skier, and this past racing season, it was the last race of the season, and here's what you need to know about races, cross-country races. You never quite know who is in the lead because at this particular race, they release the skiers in waves. Well, my son, he took off, and something just seemed off. Lap after lap, something wasn't right. And the minute he finished, he was frustrated. He said, "Dad, I was just so slow." And as a typical middle school boy, he went off, he sulked. "I did terrible," he said. "I'm such a loser." Well, it was about an hour later that a mom came running over to us. The results to the race had been posted. And guess what? He got first place. First place! He thought he'd performed miserably, but he ended up winning the entire race. Gang, today we're looking at what Paul had to say about the good life in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And honestly, when those first Christians read these words that Paul wrote all those many years ago, I imagine they wondered, so, as Christians, are we winners or are we losers? Folks, I'm so thankful that you chose to be part of this study of the book of 1 Corinthians. We're calling the study The Good Life Is, because this letter that Paul wrote, 1 Corinthians, he wrote it some 2,000 years ago. And in it, he paints, in word after word, a picture of the life that God wants to give people like you and people like me. And today, we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. Now, here's what you need to know. Like much of Paul's writings, his words can sound really confusing here. Paul often leaves us scratching our head, wondering, what in the world is he talking about? For example, what does he mean when in verse 9 he says, "God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession like people sentenced to death"? What is that all about? Well, to understand it, it actually helps to understand Paul's context and the sort of associations Paul's readers would have sort of naturally made. You see, Paul and all those he was writing to, they knew what it looked like to win. Rome won almost all of their military battles, and when they did, they'd throw a parade. The soldiers paraded through the city streets in a display of power and victory and glory, sort of like the winners of the Super Bowl or the World Series. They parade through the streets of their respective town or city. These soldiers, they'd march through the streets with the treasure they'd acquired when they'd plundered town after town, sort of like Patrick Mahomes carrying the Vince Lombardi trophy. But at the end of the parade, there they paraded those they had captured. They were weary, haggard, humiliated, this foolish-looking gang of prisoners who would end up in prison, or they'd be killed, even sold as slaves. So when we read Paul's words, we wonder, so as Christians, Paul, which are we? Are we the winners? Are we the losers? And he suggests that we are like those prisoners put on display at the end of the procession, like people sentenced to death. In verse 9 through 13, Paul writes, "We have become a public show for the world. We are fools because of the Messiah. We are weak. We go hungry. We are badly clothed. We are slandered like the rubbish of the world, fit only to be scraped off the plate and thrown away like everyone else." This is what Paul writes. As followers of Jesus, how do we live the good life? We're made losers so that nobody gets puffed up, he says. In verse 1, Paul writes, "This is how we should be thought of, as servants." For Paul, following Jesus means we are willing to take the position of a slave, the place of a prisoner, to become a loser, if you will. But in doing so, he says, we are stewards of God's mysteries. Because as followers of Jesus, the great mystery of all time is that Jesus, in losing, well, we have won. In Jesus' dying, we have life. In Jesus becoming like a slave, we are like royalty. You see, for a follower of Jesus, it's when we lose that we actually win. So here are a couple of questions for today. Which is your Christian identity more wrapped up in? Being a winner or a loser? And why is it important as followers of Jesus to make sure we don't get puffed up, as Paul says? Where do you see Christians puffed up and it having a sort of negative impact on faith? Thanks for tuning in, everybody.